They don't stop targeting you because you finally said exactly the right thing. They stop when you stop being useful to them. And what's unsettling is this: what truly makes them lose interest isn't strength in the way you imagine. It's something much quieter, almost invisible. If this is already shifting your perspective, pause for a moment, subscribe, like, or save this, because what comes next might completely reshape how you deal with them. Most people assume a narcissist stops targeting someone because that person finally stood up for themselves, exposed them, or somehow won the conflict. But that's not how this dynamic actually works. A narcissist isn't driven by resolution, fairness, or even dominance in the usual sense. They are driven by something much more basic: supply. Supply is the emotional response they draw out of you. It can be admiration, attention, fear, confusion, anger, or even your attempts to fix things. As long as you stay emotionally engaged, you are providing something they can use. This is why even negative reactions keep you in their focus. If you argue back, defend yourself, or try to prove your point, you're still feeding the system. In fact, stronger emotional reactions often make you an even more valuable target because they confirm that the narcissist has influence over your inner state. To them, that's power. What actually changes things is not what you say, but what you stop giving. When your emotional responses become minimal, neutral, or completely absent, the dynamic begins to break down. It's not about forcing yourself to suppress emotions, but about genuinely disengaging from the need to react, explain, or seek validation from them. Without that emotional output, there's nothing for them to extract, nothing to manipulate, and nothing to sustain their interest. Over time, this lack of supply makes the interaction feel unrewarding. It becomes like pressing a button that no longer works. And narcissists, by their nature, are constantly seeking efficiency. They gravitate toward people who respond, react, and can be influenced. When you no longer serve that function, you become less relevant in their cycle. Emotional detachment is often misunderstood as coldness, indifference, or shutting down completely. But that's not what makes it powerful in this situation. True emotional detachment is about reclaiming control over your internal world so that another person no longer dictates how you feel, react, or behave. When dealing with a narcissist, your emotional responses are the very thing they observe and manipulate. They are highly attuned to shifts in your tone, your expressions, your frustration, and even your attempts to stay calm. All of that gives them data, and that data helps them adjust their behavior to maintain control. When you are emotionally entangled, even if you believe you are standing your ground, you are still reacting within their frame. You are still invested in being understood, in correcting the narrative, or in getting some form of acknowledgement. That investment keeps you tied to them. Emotional detachment breaks that connection. It allows you to step out of the loop where every action they take requires a reaction from you. This doesn't mean you stop feeling, it means you stop performing those feelings for them. Instead of reacting impulsively, you respond when necessary with intention, brevity, and neutrality. You begin to notice their patterns without internalizing them. Their provocations may still happen, but they no longer land with the same intensity because you're not giving them meaning or energy. Over time, this creates a noticeable shift. The narcissist may escalate temporarily, trying different tactics to re-engage you emotionally. But when those attempts consistently fail, it disrupts the pattern they rely on. Without your emotional participation, the interaction becomes one-sided and ineffective, and that loss of control reduces their incentive to continue targeting you. Predictability might sound like a weakness, but in this dynamic, it becomes a form of quiet strength. Narcissists thrive on variability in your reactions. They test, provoke, and push boundaries to see how you will respond. When your behavior is inconsistent, when sometimes you react strongly and other times you withdraw, it creates a kind of emotional slot machine effect. They keep engaging because there's always a chance they'll get a strong reaction, and that unpredictability keeps you interesting to them. When you become predictable in a grounded, controlled way, that entire mechanism starts to fail. Predictability here doesn't mean being passive or compliant. It means your responses are steady, measured, and emotionally consistent. If you set a boundary, you enforce it the same way every time. If you choose not to engage in certain conversations, you don't suddenly make exceptions when you're tired, triggered, or hoping for a different outcome. Your behavior stops being something they can experiment with. This kind of consistency removes the reward uncertainty that keeps them hooked. If every attempt to provoke you leads to the same calm, neutral, or disengaged response, there's nothing new for them to explore, no leverage to gain, no emotional spike to chase. You become, in their perception, flat and uninteresting, not because you lack depth, but because you are no longer emotionally accessible in a way they can exploit. At first, they may push harder, trying to break that pattern. They may intensify their tactics, become more provocative, or even switch between charm and hostility. But when your predictability holds, it sends a clear message. The old strategies no longer work here. And for someone who relies on emotional reactions to feel a sense of control, that predictability makes you far less appealing as a target. Boundaries are often talked about as if simply stating them is enough. But with a narcissist, words alone don't carry much weight. You can clearly say, "Don't speak to me like that," or "I'm not discussing this," and they may ignore it, challenge it, or even mock it. That's because boundaries in this context are not about what you say. They're about what you consistently do. A boundary without enforcement is just a suggestion. And narcissists are highly skilled at testing suggestions to see where they can push through. What gives a boundary real power is repetition and follow through. It's the pattern you create over time. If every time a line is crossed, you respond in the same controlled, predictable way, whether that's disengaging from the conversation, leaving the room, ending the call, or refusing to participate, you start to shift the dynamic, not because they suddenly respect your boundary, but because the outcome becomes inconvenient or unrewarding for them. Inconsistent enforcement is what keeps you stuck. If sometimes you hold the boundary and other times you give in, maybe because you're exhausted, hopeful, or trying to keep the peace, you teach them that persistence works. They learn that if they push long enough, they'll eventually get access again. That reinforces their behavior and keeps you in the cycle. Consistent enforcement, on the other hand, removes that loophole. It shows that the boundary is not flexible based on your mood or their tactics. Over time, this creates a kind of psychological barrier. They may not like it and they may test it repeatedly, but when the result is always the same, it stops being worth the effort. The interaction becomes structured in a way that limits their ability to extract control, and that limitation reduces their motivation to keep targeting you. A narcissist's behavior runs on a loop: provoke, observe, extract, repeat. That loop depends on one critical element: your reaction. Every time they say something dismissive, critical, or confusing, they're not just expressing themselves. They're testing a mechanism. They're watching closely to see what kind of emotional output they can trigger in you. Your frustration, your attempts to clarify, your anger, even your silence if it's loaded with tension, all of it feeds information back into that loop. When you react in a noticeable way, the loop gets reinforced. It tells them this works. And once something works, they refine it. They may escalate it, repeat it, or adjust it slightly to get an even stronger response. This is why interactions can feel repetitive yet increasingly intense over time. It's not random, it's iterative. They are calibrating their behavior based on what consistently gets a reaction from you. What disrupts this cycle is not a better argument or a more emotional plea. It's the absence of a usable reaction. When your responses become minimal, neutral, or absent altogether, the feedback they rely on starts to disappear. It's like speaking into a microphone that's suddenly been unplugged. They may still talk, provoke, or push, but they're no longer getting the signal back that tells them it's effective. At first, this often leads to escalation. They might try new tactics, increase intensity, or attempt to pull you back into the loop in different ways. But when every variation leads to the same flat, unresponsive outcome, the pattern begins to collapse. Without reinforcement, the behavior loses its purpose. And when the control loop stops producing results, their focus naturally begins to shift elsewhere. One of the most subtle but powerful shifts happens when your attention moves away from the narcissist and back onto yourself. As long as your focus is on them, what they're doing, what they're thinking, how they feel about you, or how to fix the situation, you remain psychologically tied into their orbit. Even if you're frustrated or trying to break free, that constant mental engagement keeps them at the center of your experience and, in a way, continues to give them influence. Narcissists benefit from being the focal point of your attention. Your analysis of their behavior, your attempts to understand them, and your efforts to manage their reactions all keep you invested. It becomes a cycle where your energy is directed outward toward them instead of inward toward your own stability and well-being. This outward focus makes it easier for them to affect you because your awareness is tuned to their movements. When you begin to shift that focus inward, something changes. You start prioritizing your routines, your goals, your emotional regulation, and your sense of peace. Instead of asking, why are they doing this? You begin asking, what do I need right now? That shift may seem simple, but it breaks the pattern of constant monitoring and reacting. You become less available, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. Over time, this reduces their ability to influence your state. Their actions may still occur, but they no longer dominate your attention or dictate your responses. Without that steady stream of focus and engagement, their presence in your life becomes less central. And when you're no longer revolving around them, their capacity to pull you back into their dynamic weakens significantly. Narcissists are not loyal to people. They are loyal to sources of supply. Their attention goes where the return is highest with the least resistance. This is why it can feel confusing or even personal when they suddenly shift focus away from you. It's not necessarily because they've had a realization or because something meaningful has changed internally. It's often a much simpler calculation. Where can they get the most reaction, attention, or control right now? When you begin to reduce your emotional responsiveness, enforce boundaries consistently, and stop participating in their patterns, interacting with you starts to require more effort. It becomes less predictable for them in terms of reward, not because you're inconsistent, but because the outcome is consistently unrewarding. There's no emotional spike, no prolonged engagement, no sense of influence. For someone who relies on quick and reliable feedback, this feels like a poor investment. At the same time, there are usually other people in their environment who are more reactive, more available, or less aware of the dynamic. These individuals often unintentionally provide easier access to the kind of supply the narcissist seeks. They may engage more, explain more, defend more, or try harder to be understood, all of which creates a richer stream of emotional output. So the narcissist's attention shifts, not in a clean or respectful way, and not necessarily permanently, but in a way that reflects their ongoing search for efficiency. They gravitate toward dynamics that feel easier to control and more immediately rewarding. And when compared to those, you begin to stand out less, not because you've diminished, but because you've become less accessible in the way they require. The most important shift isn't what you do to them, it's what you do for yourself. Healing is often misunderstood as something separate from the dynamic, as if it's just about feeling better while the situation continues unchanged. But in reality, your healing directly alters how the dynamic functions. When you begin to understand your patterns, your triggers, and the reasons you stayed engaged, you start to respond differently, not through force, but through clarity. Narcissistic dynamics often persist because they connect to something unresolved. Your need for validation, your discomfort with conflict, your tendency to over-explain, or your hope that things will eventually make sense. Healing brings awareness to these patterns. It allows you to recognize when you're being pulled into familiar loops, and more importantly, gives you the ability to choose a different response. As you become more grounded, you stop seeking closure from someone who cannot provide it. You stop over-investing in being understood by someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. Your sense of self becomes less dependent on their reactions, which means their approval or disapproval carries less weight. This doesn't happen instantly, but as it develops, your behavior naturally shifts. You become less reactive, more decisive, and less willing to engage in interactions that drain you. This internal change is what makes you less available to the dynamic as a whole. You're no longer playing the same role, and without that role, the pattern struggles to continue. The narcissist may still attempt to engage, but the connection they relied on is no longer there in the same way. Your healing doesn't just help you cope, it quietly removes you from the system that kept you targeted in the first place. In the end, what makes a narcissist stop targeting you isn't a dramatic moment, a perfect comeback, or finally being understood. It's the quiet, consistent shift in what you give and what you no longer give. When the emotional supply dries up, when your reactions no longer fuel their control, when your boundaries hold without exception, and when your focus returns to your own life, the dynamic loses its power. This isn't about changing them, it's about stepping out of a system that depended on your participation to survive. And once you're no longer feeding it, no longer orbiting it, no longer reacting to it in the same way, you become less relevant to their patterns, not because you lost, but because you stopped playing a game that was never designed for you to win. And that's the real shift. When your peace matters more than their perception, when your energy is no longer available for manipulation, and when your healing becomes stronger than their pull, that's when the targeting fades, not with a dramatic ending, but with a quiet loss of interest that finally sets you free.